Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Gravel Ride Podcast. I'm your host, Craig Dalton. This week on the podcast, I've got two guests from Salsa Cycles and QBP talking about the 2020 Salsa Cutthroat. We've got Peter Hall and Joe Meiser from the team that have been intimately involved in the design and manufacturing of the Salsa Cutthroat. It's a really interesting bike for this podcast as we've sort of tended towards middle of the road gravel bikes in terms of tire width. We've touched on some road plus bikes, but we've never really danced on the other end of this category, which is where the Salsa Cutthroat clearly occupies. With 29-inch wheels, 2.4 inch tire capabilities, it's a pretty massive departure from sort of the more road-oriented gravel bikes. So I was really excited to talk to them about this bike and the intention behind the design. It was really heavily influenced by the 2,700-mile Tour Divide route and those ultra-distance events that we've talked about a little bit on this podcast. So with that, let's jump right in. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. It's always a good place for us to get started to learn a little bit more about your backgrounds as cyclists. And since we're going to be talking about a very specific product, maybe you guys can also talk about what your roles are over there at Salsa professionally.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Pete Hall. I'm one of the design engineers here at Salsa. I think the best way to describe what kind of cyclist I am is I'm at my core, I'm a mountain biker. Certainly don't discriminate against like gravel or pavement, and absolutely love both, especially gravel. But I think single track will for me always be the best. I don't know how many years I've been in the bike industry now. I've never held a job outside the bike industry. I know that.
Yeah. How about you, Joe?
Grew up in bike shops.
Yeah, so my name is Joe Meiser. I'm the senior product manager here at Salsa Cycles. I was the lead product manager on the new 2020 Cutthroat. I've been at QVP for 15 years. I've held roles as an industrial designer. I've led product development across our brands, and I've led product in Salsa full-time for the last 4 years. I came into the brand at the time when the first Cutthroat was being launched and had the opportunity to work on the second generation, which has been pretty cool. My background as a cyclist is pretty wide-ranging. Like Pete, I would say I'm a mountain biker with a drop bar problem, and I think that's probably reflected in a lot of our drop bar bikes. I started racing gravel in 2007. The first gravel race I ever did was the Trans-Iowa, and it sort of quickly careened from there. The vernacular here is gravel roads and rural roads, and so I was racing events like Ragnarok 100 in Red Wing in the Driftless region of Minnesota. I was racing the Almanzo in 2008, and about that time I decided that I would go out and do the Tour Divide, and we as a brand team had kind of started to see this niche of gravel and started designing bikes that kind of lent that direction with big tire fit, disc brakes, so on. And so I actually raced the Tour Divide in 2009 and was able to do that on the Fargo, which was really the predecessor to the Cutthroat. And then got to be part of the team when we launched the first gen Cutthroat, and now this one.
That's awesome. I'm actually really excited to talk to you guys because, as I mentioned offline, I think on this podcast, we've certainly covered road plus bikes and then bikes that are sort of in the sort of sweet spot of gravel of 700 by 40 or 650 by 47. And the Cutthroat and Salsa as a brand has always kind of occupied this more extreme end, tending towards bike packing and ultra distance events. And you're really the first company that we've had on board to talk about that. So when we think about the design of the Cutthroat, can you go through some of those key elements that make it sort of more closely related potentially to a mountain bike than a road bike?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest place to start there is it actually uses mountain bike tires. It fits up to a 29 by 24 inch tire, designed around a 100 mil suspension fork as well. The geometry is definitely more influenced on the 2020 Cutthroat from mountain bikes. Slacker head tube angles, a little bit steeper seat tubes. We slacked this one out to 69 degrees. for more of that stability for mountain biking when you're careening down a single track or, tour divide. You got a lot of gravel roads, nasty gravel roads, 2 tracks, mountain passes, that kind of stuff. So the stability is really prized there. I think part where this, the Cutthroat's influenced by more of the road side then would be obviously the drop bars. But the big one I would say would be the drivetrain we put on this. It's a boost mountain bike spacing, but we worked with Race Face in Easton to put chain rings on it so you can get road gravel chain rings, like a 4630 is what we spec it with. So you have a 2x road geared drivetrain on a mountain bike platform, so you can really get a really wide range of gearing for the really wide range of experiences the Cutthroat can do.
Interesting. And how, you sort of referenced the kind of tour divide type riding that has really kind of infused the design philosophy for this bike. What are the elements of that particular ride that kind of demand this type of bike versus kind of a narrower tired gravel bike?
For us, this goes back to the original Fargo and designing that bike. When I started to plan for the tour divide, one of the things that I really recognized was that the biggest issue that riders were having was hand and wrist issues. And they were almost all riding XC mountain bikes at the time with flat bars. Some riders had started to put aero bars on for different position and some comfort and maybe a little bit of an aero advantage. And I looked at that event and I looked at the information that was out at the time in 2005, 6, 7, just as blogs were starting to come about. And I thought, this is really ultimately just the longest gravel race in the world. And the roads that it's on, while it's billed as a mountain bike route, it's rural gravel roads, and it's stuff that we're riding these bikes on today. And so we as a team built that Fargo around a dirt drop ride experience. I mean, in a sense, influenced, or I would say absolutely influenced by, bikes like some of the Cunninghams from, the early 90s and late 80s. I've got pictures of Cunninghams still on my board at my desk from that time frame. And so we looked at it and we said, give riders multiple hand positions, give them an option to be more comfortable, and give them that choice. And that's where Fargo came from, and that's ultimately where Cutthroat comes from, is looking at that experience and designing for that experience.
Then on the Tour Divide route, are you getting into technical single track that sort of puts a drop bar bike rider in a more challenging position than a straight bar?
There are, I think, roughly 30 to 40 miles of single track on that route. Coming off the backside of Boreas Pass, after you come out of Breckenridge, there's an option. And then as you get down into Silver City, New Mexico, and you're in the Gila Mountains north of there, there's a section of the Continental Divide Trail that's open to bikes that's used. And, it is technical single track, but if you look at the overall mileage, roughly 30 to 40 miles of 2,750 miles is single track.
Yeah.
And so the bike is fully capable of riding single track, and there are a few diehard dirt drop single track riders that use it that way. But really it's about riding those rockier, rougher mountain passes where, you're descending through rocks that are, the size of softballs and basketballs and that sort of situation versus, the really buff buff gravel that we experience in gravel races on rural farm roads.
Yeah, I got to imagine also the volume of the tires that you selected for this model play an important role when you're adding a lot of weight in terms of bags and gear you're needing for a multi-day event.
Ultimately, that's the case. You're riding those big roads, and you might be able to get away with less tire, but less tire means less load support. It means a little bit less comfort. It means you got to pay a little bit more attention to tire pressures. You may be more prone to flat on high-speed descents when you're, coming across a water guard or a cattle guard at the descent bottom. And so most people just tend to trend towards a 2.1, 2.2 on that Tour Divide specific experience.
Yeah, I was getting that feedback. A colleague of mine who actually shares the same bike as I do was riding the Trans Northern California on 650B by 47. And he said to me, nothing I encountered challenged that tire width, but the weight on the bike had me playing around with air pressure so much that when it was comfortable, I was bottoming out and flatting. And if I was pumping it up too hard, it was just super uncomfortable. So it left me thinking like the bike I have is by no means really what I'd want for something like the Tour Divide for exactly the reasons you just described.
I think that's fair to say.
Speaking of handling, you obviously guys have spent a lot of time thinking about the types of loads and even built features in to help support bags and different carrying configurations that you might have in some of these long distance events. Can you talk about some of those elements of the frame and fork design?
Yeah, of course. I think we consider probably your best place to carry most of your gear is in the frame bag. It's down low, it's secure, it's in line with the center plane of the bike. It's really stable there. You obviously have your seat bag for a lot of stuff, but most of your weight really should be kept down low for handling and stability. So on the 2020 Cutthroat, we actually increased the front triangle space and designed a new bag that has little thumb screws that mount it on to. So there's a whole bunch of M5 rib nuts on the inside of that front triangle. So it's a really clean frame bag integration, not a bunch of Velcro straps to wear out your paint and that kind of stuff. And then on the fork, on both sides of the fork, we have 3-pack mounts that can take a water bottle or something like our Anything Cage HD and bag. So you can carry up to, I believe it's 8 pounds per side in the Anything Cage.
Okay.
And the handling was, it's better to put extra weight, that small extra weight on your fork really helps to slow down the steering. And the mechanical trail we designed the bike around really plays nicely with that extra weight on your handlebars from say like an Anything cradle, and then the Anything Cage having things on your fork.
Okay, so you thought about sort of slowing down the steering by the fact that, it's likely there might be some weight put on there?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Exactly.
And I think I read that
predictable.
The bike is also suspension adjusted, so you can put a suspension fork on there as well if that's your jam.
It certainly is, yeah. It can fit up to like a 29 inch wheeled 100 mil travel fork. We see that you lose a mounting point, but you gain a lot of comfort for particularly rugged routes then.
Yeah. Did you find, Joe, in your own Tour Divide experience that comfort was a challenge? Were you on a rigid fork, I assume?
When I rode, I was on a steel bike, and the steel bike really did help damp vibration on the route. And I think that's something we really saw the opportunity to do with the first gen Cutthroat. We added that Class 5 feature into the back end of our frame, so we have that technology in all of our carbon all-road bikes, and that's really building an inherent damping into the frame as well as tuning the layup of each frame to handle vibration coming the road and really isolate the rider. And that's not uncommon with aftermarket accessories now, and seat posts and stems and that sort of thing, as well as what other brands are doing. And we did that on the new bike as well with its fork. We added a feature similar to Class 5 where we added some fore-aft flex to that frame and engineered that fork to complement the frame while you're riding it. From my perspective, I really like a suspension fork on the Cutthroat. My current Cutthroat build, my favorite build now, is RockShox RS1 on the front of it and a dropper post on that bike, and it's a lot of fun to ride that way. And I hope to see more gravel bikes kind of come into the ability to handle suspension and suspension product for gravel in a lot of ways. I would say for shorter events, I had the opportunity to go do Granduro Japan as a launch event. That setup was amazing. It was super fun to ride that course in Japan on the Cutthroat. For events like the Tour Divide, I wouldn't say I'd throw it out, but I would certainly do a lot more evaluation to make sure that my fork was going to hold up to that distance. So it's a weight factor, but it's also a performance. Is that fork going to need service? Am I going to have bushing issues or seal issues during the event? And there are some recorded examples of time during the Tour Divide where forks have needed to be rebuilt in Steamboat or Silver City before hitting the finish line. because of seal issues and heat buildup and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I got to imagine with the extra weight on the front of your bike, the suspension is taking a little bit more abuse than it might do under your average body weight size.
Certainly that, and I think the higher speeds and the smaller vibration that suspension forks see during that type of activity versus off-road mountain biking, where we tend to have higher impacts.
Yeah, speaking of tuning the carbon, since you've got a bike that's potentially used in its home environment with just the rider weight, but you've also clearly built a bike that's going to carry load around it, are you having to kind of up the stiffness of it, thinking that, you know, an average 170-pound rider on a 56 centimeter frame is actually going to be 200 pounds with the additional weight they may be carrying?
We do a little bit. The rider gear is percentage-wise quite a small amount compared to the actual rider weight. So we do tune the stiffness of the bike to be a little stiffer than, like, say, if this was designed specifically to be an unloaded, like a single long day, kind of like a Warbird. This is definitely stiffer in pedaling and torsion in the handling for the front end. But honestly, about the same. We tuned the VRS to be about the same, the chainstays and fork flexibility to be pretty close because they undergo on relatively similar loads. The weight is generally further forward in the frame and not really affecting, say, how the seat stays are flexing. If we had wanted to specifically design weight to be used on a rear pannier, that's something that's designed to bolt around that rear end, then we would definitely need to consider that more. But honestly, the rider weight makes such a larger difference than the gear you're carrying.
Yeah.
Unless you're carrying like lead spoons or something.
Yeah, I imagine so. It's interesting to me, you know, as the sport, on the racing side of the sport, you've obviously got a spectrum of events from the, you know, the ultra distance stuff like Tour Divide and multi-day events, you know, across the Midwest and Iowa and different places. But you also have things like Dirty Kansas with the DK 200. And I can't help but think, you know, for the average rider, having a little bit of suspension via the bigger tires or even pure suspension on the bike starts to yield a lot of benefits. You have the trade-off of the weight, but, you know, being able to stay comfortable all day long, I think, is going to help a lot of average riders get across those big finish lines.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this a lot as the Tour Divide bike, right? So we're talking about a bike that Salsa designed for an event that annually roughly 150 riders start. For some perspective, and that's something that we chose to do as a brand because we thought it was important, but that product wouldn't be around if only 150 riders annually purchased it, but you certainly see it as the primary bicycle at the start of the Tour Divide annually. We very quickly found that riders in gravel events, particularly Dirty Kansas, did want a bike like the Cutthroat, and we saw it quickly spill over into those spaces. You talked earlier about the Big Sugar Gravel event that the founders of Dirty Kansas and Lifetime are starting in Arkansas. Well, Jim Cummins, a good friend of ours, someone who we've been involved with for a number of years with Dirty Kansas, he rides a Cutthroat in the gravel in Kansas, and that surface down there, that base chert rock that they have, how rough those roads are when you get out onto the open range, he really appreciates the big volume tires, and he talks about how he's been on group rides with other riders in Emporia, and they're on gravel and having to hold that line of the 2-track, and he'll ride up on the ridge between the 2-track because he's got 2-1 tires and a bike that's really incredibly stable. So it's much more capable in that environment. And then the other part is the fit of it. It's a much more upright bike naturally because of the longer to axle the crown on the fork, because it is suspension corrected. Your front end's a little bit higher. And so riders who want to be a little bit more upright have that comfort level. Riders that want those bigger tires for the rough roads, creek crossings, want that. And so we quickly realized that the bike was seeing that secondary use case. And that was part of our intentionality with this current gen that has just launched to the market, particularly around the drivetrain that Pete Hall talked to earlier. I've worked the booth at Dirty Kansas for a number of years. during the expo. And I can pretty much tell you that on the hour, I'm going to have a Cutthroat rider come by from a version 1 Cutthroat and say, how do I get more gears on this? Can I put 2x on this? How do I make this bike more capable of gravel? And that's where that partnership with Raceface Easton comes in to play for Salsa, and new drivetrain options like GRX from Shimano make it much easier for us to design this bike with big volume tires, 29-inch wheels, and 2x drivetrain. And I think that's pretty fantastic that we're able to get all that to work together to create a really awesome experience.
Yeah. I mean, if I can add on that, I personally used my Warbird at Dirty Kansas this year, but the year before I picked Cutthroat for Michigan's Coast to Coast gravel race purely because of the comfort of the bike, and then Michigan's just a sandy place, so those larger volume tires help you float through it, where in Kansas you're floating through gravel and chunky gravel, in Michigan you're floating through just sand. The Cutthroat, while you get more comfort out of it, comfort often equals speed for a lot of people, especially if you maybe aren't at the pointy end of the race trying to win. Being more comfortable over a 10, 14 plus hour day makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you describe the Warbird a little bit for us?
So Warbird is Salsa's gravel race bike. Warbird was the first gravel race bike to exist in the industry. We started that product somewhere around, I think if we had to nail it down, I think we'd say we launched the first one right around 2014. It seems like forever ago for us, but it's not that long ago.
Yeah.
And it's now on its 4th generation. We launched that last year in 2019. And you'll see a lot of the same features shared between Cutthroat and Warbird. And so you'll see a bike that's designed for up to a 700 by 45 tire or 650 by 47, but you'll see that shorter axle to crown. You'll see that lower stack, that ability to get into that more, road or gravel race position.
Okay, so at a simple level, like we're talking different wheel size and different tire width capabilities, up to the Cutthroat being sort of maxing out at 29 by 2.4.
Correct.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, gotcha. I think it's interesting in the conversations I have and just anecdotally with the riders I interact with, there's loads of gravel athletes who are coming from the road side. So the jump to the Cutthroat just seems absolutely massive to them when they're just thinking, oh, I'm riding a road bike off road. But I do think, and I have seen over the last 4 years or so, that people are embracing more and more mountain bike style bikes and mountain bike technologies on the gravel scene, because they're just seeing they can simply go faster and be more comfortable.
Absolutely.
I think you guys are ahead of the curve there, actually.
Well, appreciate that. I'll take a second too. We recognize that. You talked about road racers, road riders coming off of a more traditional road bike where it's quick, it's snappy, it's stiff. For Salsa, we see an opportunity to really meet riders with how they're coming into the sport and make a product for them wherever they may be at. Cutthroat, one of the jokes for us in the Cutthroat is it's the mountain biker's gravel bike, right?
Yep.
It's not a big leap for someone who's been riding mountain bikes to go, well, sure, big fat tires. Why wouldn't I want to do that? Warbird's really kind of that more dead center gravel race bike. There's a lot of competition in that space over the last several years with other brands coming into gravel. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have our War Road, which is our endurance road bike. But even as a road bike, it fits up to a 700 by 35 or a 650 by 47. And that bike, if you look at it in its purest form in the geometry and tire fit and handling, fits pretty closely into the endurance road space, but with some additional capability to haul gear, haul a load, do an occasional gravel race that's not incredibly aggressive. And so if you have that rider that is coming off the road and they're like, man, all these gravel bikes are really kind of slow and they're really long and I want something snappier, that War Road is kind of that choice for them. And so we have 3 performance carbon gravel bikes for riders across the board.
Yeah, I think that's super important to note. And I'm a big fan of a gravel bike and a couple different sets of wheels and riding that on the road. So I love one. It sounds like in your suite, it would probably be the Warbird, where it would fit my fancy. It's super off-road capable, but slap a set of road wheels on there, and you're not really feeling like you're missing a beat.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. It's that, best all-arounder ultimately for a rider who's going to have their gravel bike.
Yeah, and in talking to you guys, I mean, listeners know here in Marin County, I feel like I'm squarely in mountain bike territory in terms of what I consider gravel riding, and I like something aggressive with a big volume tire. I feel like I'm probably a pretty good Cutthroat customer, and maybe even, as I think Joe was mentioning, a suspended Cutthroat would be a hell of a lot of fun here in Marin County.
I think that's the case, maybe in a lot of places and Marin's this kind of place where you have a lot of back roads, but then you have like those single track cut-throughs and that sort of thing. And I think that's one of the things that makes Cutthroat fun, is you can, pop along the creek for us, or pop along the river and ride some single track, pop back out, hit the pavement, hit a alley cut through, whatever the case might be, and in a variety of situations, have a good time.
Yeah.
Joe's describing his commute home right there, pretty much.
I love it. Well, yeah, no, it's an exciting time to be in the industry and an exciting time to be a consumer. I think one of the drivers for me starting this podcast was really my personal journey to figuring out what bike is right for me. And every day, I don't think I'm actually getting any closer to it, because there's just so many options. And the key is to just find a bike that has the level of versatility that you're looking for, and figure out the right wheelhouse you're in. So if you're, a big off-road rider, grab a Cutthroat. It'll still work fine on the road, but it's not going to be the fastest thing on your group ride. If being the fastest on your group ride's your jam, then it sounds like the Warbird Road, and get some knobbies to take you on gentle off-road trails might be the way to go.
For sure.
I think that's a good understanding.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time, you guys. I know it's a Friday afternoon, and it sounds like Joe's got an enviable commute on the way home, so I don't want to keep you any longer. Anything else you want to reveal about 2020 for Salsa and where you see this market going?
That's a big question. I certainly have a crystal ball of where I think the market is going. I think, to echo your statement, there's a myriad of awesome options available to riders out there. And, for Salsa, we want to, like I said, meet that rider where they're at, and how they're coming into gravel, because there are a huge number of riders still coming into gravel as a discipline and as a sport. I think we'll see a lot more technical advancements along the way here, without giving too much away. Like I said, I think suspension is going to be interesting, and see if we see, forks like the Fox really kind of take off and come into the sport and influence it more so. Full suspension gravel bikes, we're starting to see little things like that. There's that intersection of mountain and road going on that's interesting and exciting, and it's fun for us to be a part of it as well.
Definitely. I think it's interesting to see as what'll happen in the next couple of years in the gravel scene, as American domestic road racing, the traditional road racing, starts to die out, unfortunately, and more of that group goes to gravel, to see how that changes gravel, because I think it's mostly been a lot of influence from mountain bikes so far, but it'll be interesting to see how gravel evolves in the next couple of years. World Tour pros retiring to win DK.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how gravel race organizers are able to keep it dirty, if you will, meaning keep it weird, keep it fun. I think evidence has shown that a great World Tour pro cannot just toe the line and expect to win any one of these races. The terrain dictates a lot of how they're going to be successful, or whether their traditional road tactics will have any advantages whatsoever. I also think it's going to be interesting as the prize purses and the sponsorship dollars continue to increase in gravel. Will we see some of these road pros adopt some of this suspension technology or other things that we've already seen the light bulbs come on about, because it's purely going to make them go faster? To your point about Bentonville, there's only a certain number of lines that you can go down comfortably on some of those roads, and being able to peek out and slam through some riverbeds and bigger sized rocks, it could be an advantage in some of these races that have those technical elements in the terrain.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so gentlemen, I really appreciate the time. I love learning more about the Cutthroat. It's a category of bike that's always intrigued me, and I'm a huge fan of the Tour Divide. So I appreciate you guys supporting those athletes and giving that perspective in addition to the other elements of the sport that you guys have been focused on.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your time as well, and the ability to kind of share our story and our product.
Big thanks to Peter and Joe for joining the podcast this week. It was fun for me geeking out around the Tour Divide and this type of bike. I don't know about you guys, but every June I am a dot watcher. I love watching the Tour Divide. I love looking at all the rigs, and it was interesting talking to them about the different kind of performance requirements of riding a bike that distance. I have to say, you walk away from a conversation like that really thinking about the fun factor of riding these drop bar bikes, and the Cutthroat with those large tires would likely be a hell of a lot of fun, particularly here in Marin County, and quite versatile when you think about the type of off-road adventures you can do with it fully loaded, kind of expedition style out there in the woods. So that's it for this week's podcast. As always, I welcome your feedback. You can hit me up at craig@thegravelride.bike or on Instagram or Facebook. As always, it's a big help if you can rate or review, and definitely share this podcast with friends. Helping with discovery is one of our biggest challenges here at The Gravel Ride. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.